Okay, let's move on. So we are continuing to use the variables in our code. We are continuing to use ints and strings, but we also, at this point, have been using very sequential coding structures. So do this, do this, do this, and do this, and then it's done. Well, code allows us to do different things. We could actually have what we call control structures in our code. So we can make decisions. We can do one thing or another based on a certain output, or we can do things repetitively. So we can run looping structures is what we call repetitions. So there are a couple ways to do that, and we'll get to that soon enough. But the most prominent way of making a decision in Python is using the if-else structure, okay? And you see it down here. I'm using the if-else name structure, and in between, I've got what's called the else if or the ELIF, else if structure. So let me comment this out for just a moment so you can see what I'm talking about. And so I have if else. So if this is true, run this code. If it's not true, run the next code. And if nothing's there, don't run anything at all. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if the statement, if the condition next to the elf keyword is true, and that's what it's trying to evaluate, if it is true. If it is true, run whatever block of code is underneath it, okay? And right now, just for example's sake, I have this basic print statement here. And this just says that if number one is greater than number two, whatever the evaluation is, then do it. Okay, execute this line of code. If it is false, do not execute this line of code. Go to the next line, which in this case is the else statement, and run this. Now, if for whatever reason I chose not to even have that, just that if this were true, run this code. If it were not true, if it were false, move on to the next line of code down here. And that's okay too. But for right now, I actually want to make some comparisons. Oops, let's go back. There we go. So let's take a look at what's going on here. I have a number one, and it's an int. I have declared a variable called num1 up here, and I've declared another variable called num2. Now, what do I mean by declared? So at the beginning of my program, I've actually established the fact that there are at least two variables. One of them is called num1, number one. One of them is called num2, number two. So with that being said, I have assigned them values, both of them being 0, and I'm allowed to do that. So, and as you can see, 0 is an integer, 0 is an integer. They do not have quotations around them. That would change their data type. I want to actually use them as numbers. So right now, both variables are seen as numbers. Now I have commented this out. I'll go ahead and take this out altogether so it doesn't confuse anybody. And as you can also see, I am now using comments in my program. So what's a comment? A comment is a line that you can see as the coder, but that has a pound sign in front of it, okay? Pound or hashtag. So what that means is it's going to change to green here in Visual Studio Code, and that although you as the coder can see it, you can read it, it's giving you some identification as to what's supposed to go on in the next couple of lines of code. However, the computer is not going to see it as part of the code instruction block, or what we call the source code. and it's going to ignore it. It's going to ignore it. It's not going to consider it as part of the instructions. It's going to only run this. It's going to see num1 equals 0, num2 equals 0. It'll go down here. It'll see display instructions, but it won't run that code. It will see print. It will execute on this line of code, and this is a string. So this program will compare two numbers, colon, greater than, less than, or equal to. Maybe not the best instructions, but okay for now. And after it runs this print statement, it will go to the next line and run the next print statement. You will provide the numbers for comparison. So this is going to allow the user to input two numbers. Now, num1 is up here, num2 is up here, and as you can see, they are being defaulted to strings, so I need to use the int function right here in my code so that I know that I could use these two. Now the reason I did this is because earlier when I was doing this, I was using this and not this in my classroom. So I can manipulate these two numbers and they would actually work down here. But when I receive input from a user, it defaults as a string. And now these will work as numbers. So what I can do now is actually comment the, oops, it's not what I wanted to do, is actually comment those out because I don't want to use them and just use my input values from my user, okay? So with that being said, let's talk about what's going on. If, and this is what's going to be read first, each line of code gets read sequentially, and in an if-else structure, the first one that reads that evaluates to true, that's the block of code that will execute. It won't go any further in that structure because it doesn't need to. It's only going to read or evaluate every line, every if, else, if statement, and then the first one that evaluates to true, it's going to execute that code block, and the code block is everything underneath of it. So just to see it, we'll do this. Okay, so you can see that this is my block of code. It's called a code block. Underneath my if statement, this is my block of code underneath my else if statement, and this is my block of code under my else statement. So if this if statement evaluates to true, this print statement will run. It'll execute, and it won't even worry about these two statements. It'll just go, and that will be it. And actually, I will even do this. It'll just stop the program. If, however, this num1 is less than num2, then this is false. So then it will evaluate, and I could even do this. Num2 is greater than num1, or num1 is less than num2. Okay. So if num1 is greater than num2, run this. If number 1 is less than number 2. So greater than, less than. The only thing else is if they're actually equal to each other. If they were the same number, then I could say this. And I could even do this way. Num1 is equal to num2. And if we wanted to, I could just put the equal sign. So let's see what happens. If I run this, and I'm going to go all the way down here, show this, enter a number, 4 and 6. 6 is greater than 4. That's correct. So it can evaluate numbers appropriately. Excuse me. Let's run it again. So what happens if I do 4 and 4? 4 is equal to 4. And one more time. 10 and 15, and 10 is greater than, 10 and 15. So 15 is greater than 10. Perfect. So we know our code works because we know our math. And this is a good starting point because evaluating expressions and executing things based on different inputs is really important to code. So with that being said, hopefully this was of value to you, and I will see you next time.